Well, good afternoon, everyone.
My son was stationed.
Another jam-packed noon event at the Tower Center. I'm Bob Jordan, diplomat in residence here in the Tower Center, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you here today. We're really honored today to have Martin Adams. Marty Adams, when I was ambassador to Saudi Arabia, was my political military counselor. And I emphasize the word counselor. I can recall in an earlier life, I had a mentor who was a lawyer, well-known lawyer here in town, and I was paying tribute to him and said that he taught me all I know. Someone in the back of the room yelled, "Yeah, but he didn't teach you all he knew." I think you can say the same thing about Martin Adams. He taught me a whole lot about what I knew or thought I knew, but he certainly didn't teach me all he knows. And he's served also in many posts in the Foreign Service, about a 29-year career as a Foreign Service officer, most of which has been overseas. He has also served as the political advisor to the commander of the 5th Fleet in Bahrain. And one of those tours was in the service of Admiral Pat Walsh, who some of you know here, and who is a senior fellow here in the Tower Center as well.
And it's never in town anytime I come to visit. But
he leaves town as soon as he hears Marty's coming. But I don't want to take up more time. I want to introduce Martin Adams to you and let him tell us what he knows, which is a lot, about Turkey.
well, first of all, thank you for those kind words, Ambassador. And it is an honor to be here again. I had the privilege of talking to this group about a year or a year plus ago, I think. And I thought I would talk a bit about Turkey. I served in Turkey for 6 years, but from 1981 to 87, and a senior desk officer for Turkey 1994 to 1996, and have kept up with events since that time. So if we can, I'd like to begin about the coups, plural, and their aftermath, and then about Turkey's recent foreign policy. In the past 55 years, there have been 5 coups. Only the last one was unsuccessful. The first coup, in 1960, the increasingly autocratic Premier Adnan Menderes was deposed in a largely bloodless military takeover. Intolerance and repression of opposition, factionalism, and unwillingness to compromise have historically been the besetting weaknesses of Turkish government. And Menderes exhibited all of these traits. Following the coup, General Jamal Gürsel was named president, premier, and defense minister. The purpose of the coup was to restore a semblance of democratic government. Menderes was hanged, as were 3 of his senior ministers. Importantly, and it's a sign of the times, his ejection from office and subsequent execution have become increasingly controversial. When I first arrived in Turkey, which was shortly after the 1980 coup, a large majority still believed that the military intervention was justified to preserve the development of democracy. In the last several years, however, opinion has shifted 180 degrees, with a majority apparently believing the military intervention was unjustified, and more than anything else was a successful effort by the Ataturkist military and political elite to reassert its authority in the face of the challenge Menderes had successfully mounted against them. There are arguments to be made on both sides. In any case, Menderes was a major figure in Turkish political history, as he created a party that successfully and for the first time opposed the Ataturkist political-military combination. Süleyman Demirel's Justice Party inherited Menderes' mantle. Also, the precedent of military intervention against Menderes to put Turkish government back on the rails for democracy formed the justification for all subsequent coups, including the last one. Erdogan is often compared to Menderes, whose grave is now a mausoleum. The second in the series was the famous coup by memorandum. As the 1960s wore on, violence and instability plagued Turkey. An economic recession late that decade sparked a wave of social unrest marked by street demonstrations, labor strikes, and political assassinations. Left-wing workers and student movements were formed, countered on the right by Islamist and militant nationalist groups. The left carried out bombing attacks, robberies, and kidnappings from the end of 1968, and increasingly during 1969 and 1970, left-wing violence was matched and surpassed by what was done on the far right wing. Factions defected from Prime Minister Demirel's government to form splinter groups of their own, gradually reducing his parliamentary majority and bringing the legislative process to a halt. By January 1971, Turkey was in chaos. The universities had ceased to function. Students emulating Latin American urban guerrillas robbed banks and kidnapped U.S. servicemen and attacked other American targets. The homes of university professors critical of the government were bombed by neo-fascist militants. The Islamist movement had become more aggressive and had openly rejected Ataturk and Kemalism, which infuriated the armed forces. Demirel's government seemed paralyzed, powerless to curb the campus and street violence, and unable to pass any serious legislation on social or economic issues. On March 12, 1971, the chief of the General Staff, Memduh Tamaç, handed the Prime Minister a memorandum demanding formation within the context of democratic principles of a strong and credible government, which would stop the chaos and implement the reformist laws envisioned by the Constitution, putting an end to the anarchy, fratricidal strife, and social and economic unrest. If the demands were not met, the army would exercise its constitutional duty and take power itself. Demirel resigned. In 1980, it happened again. Turkey at that time was virtually on its knees. There were something like 10 assassinations per day, and amid widespread violence perpetrated by both leftist and rightist groups. The economy had largely ceased to function. There was triple-digit inflation. The currency was falling through the floor. After a long stretch of political infighting, the parliament had ceased to function. No legislation had been passed for months. Sounds a little like Washington. The four leading political figures, Demirel, Bülent Ecevit, Necmettin Erbakan, and Alparslan Türkeş, detested each other. The last two were justifiably suspected of having connections with groups engaging in violence and possibly with drug trafficking to finance their extracurricular activities. On September 12, the National Security Council, headed by Chief of Staff Kenan Evren, announced the coup d'etat on national TV. The council then extended martial law throughout the country, abolished the parliament and the government, suspended the constitution, and banned all political parties and trade unions. They invoked the Kemalist tradition of state secularism and the unity of the nation, which had already justified the preceding coups, and presented themselves as opposed to communism, fascism, separatism, and religious sectarianism. This was a classic coup. It was also quite popular. Civilians waved at tanks rumbling through the streets of Istanbul. Automobile drivers shook hands with soldiers who manned the roadblocks. Storekeepers raised their bomb-proof shutters for the first time in months. Restaurants began to fill up in the evenings. Some city dwellers looked far trimmer than usual, simply because they no longer packed pistols inside their coats and waistcoats. The crackdown that accompanied this very well-planned operation was impressive. More than 2,000 were under arrest by the end of the first week, and the offices of some 150 labor unions were closed down. Members of leftist and rightist groups were rounded up and put on jail by military tribunals. Within a very short time, there were an estimated 250,000 or more detainees. Among them, 230,000 were tried, 14,000 were stripped of citizenship, and 50 were executed. Ecevit, Demirel, Turkesh, and Erbakan, the first two future presidents of Turkey and the last a future prime minister, were incarcerated and temporarily suspended from politics. The junta also ordered citizens to remove all political slogans from their walls. A martial law communique said that everyone is responsible for his or her own wall. If you cannot afford new paint, you should call the martial law authorities in your neighborhood and they will provide it. Nevertheless, before 3 years were up, the military regime made good on the promise of a return to democracy. I was there for part of this. My cook, housekeeper, a very pleasant man, when he would talk to you, he would bow like this, was turned in by a neighbor for having a gun in his... Excuse me?
I hear you.
Okay. My cook, housekeeper, a very pleasant man, he would talk to you and bow like this, was turned in by his neighbor for having a gun in his house. He was mistreated. I'm not sure how to characterize what seems to have been fairly light torture, for lack of a better term. After a few days, he was released. At that time, he was told, "You are a good citizen. You have a family. Don't do it again." I asked him how he felt about the government that had mistreated him in such a fashion, and I got one of my larger insights into the Turkish character when he said, "Such treatment should be reserved for leftists and other undesirables." The problem was that the military, as professional and competent as they are, or perhaps were, proved not to be good at all as social and political engineers. The Constitution adopted after the 1960 takeover, in part in reaction to the autocracy practiced by Menderes, was, as Demirel expressed, all brake and no accelerator. It was one of the elements that sustained the political divisions and extreme factionalism that led to the 1971 and 1980 coups. After the 1980 intervention, the military drafted yet another constitution, but also tried to tinker with the political system. It established its own party, the National Democracy Party, under the leadership of Turgut Sunalp, a rather colorless retired general. It was clobbered in the '83 elections by the newly formed Anavatan Motherland Party, led by a rising politician and economist named Turgut Özal, whom the military had recruited to fix Turkey's economy, which had come to grief in large part due to the statist policy Ataturk had instituted that the military, which was largely clueless in economics, had maintained. Özal sought to unite within his party the diverse and quarreling factions that hitherto had characterized Turkish politics: nationalism, devotion to Islam, commercial liberalism, commercial liberalism, and democratic government. The chief problem with this party is that it took a Turgut Özal, whose health ultimately failed, to manage it. Ultimately, the party broke apart and factionalism resumed as the leaders from the previous era, Demirel, Erbakan, and the others, returned to the fray and were free to engage in factional maneuvering as well as getting rich in Turkey's increasingly prosperous economy. Demirel became president following the death of Özal, who had been a bitter rival. Leadership of the DYP Doğru Yol Party True Path Party passed to Tansu Çiller. DYP was a successor party formed by Demirel and his cronies when the military banned the Justice Party. Renaming and relaunching parties is a common practice in Turkey whenever political groupings are banned. Kurdish group, religious-oriented parties, and less controversial parties like the Justice Party have all engaged in that practice. Another set of elections ultimately resulted in yet another coup. The election in 1995 was an unprecedented success for Necmettin Erbakan's religious-oriented Refah welfare party. His was the largest group in the new parliament. But in order to avoid the possibility of another coup, Prime Minister Tansu Çiller stayed in power and formed a minority government with the weakened Anavatan party under Mesut Yilmaz. A vote of confidence forced this government out and installed Erbakan as prime minister, with Çiller's party jumping ship to serve as the junior member of the governing coalition. Mrs. Çiller became deputy prime minister and foreign minister and was promised that Erbakan would ultimately vacate the prime ministership in her favor. Perhaps unimportantly, there was no set time when this was supposed to happen. In 1997, the military pressured Erbakan out of power. Intriguingly, the military was reportedly encouraged to take this step by elements in Çiller's Doğru Yol party. Whether she was involved in the intrigue is not immediately clear. She was trying to use the growing pressure from the military to push Erbakan into honoring his agreement to vacate his office in her favor. The military demanded that Erbakan stop or reverse policies seen as promoting Islam in government affairs, and his government was forced to step down on 28 February 1997 following a meeting of the National Security Council. This coup is interesting in a couple of ways. Beyond the possible pressure and maneuvering by Mrs. Çiller and her party, the precipitating event, as I recently learned, was an iftar dinner at the Prime Minister's residence to which a number of Naqshbandi sheikhs were invited. This may seem fairly innocuous, particularly given the orientation of the current Erdogan government. But symbolism is always important in Turkish politics. And an event of such demonstrated religiosity would at that time have been deemed totally unacceptable by the military. Anyway, Erbakan's welfare party was later outlawed. This was termed the first postmodern coup. The military's involvement remained largely behind the scenes, and Erbakan was replaced not by a general but by another civilian government. Incidentally, contrary to Çiller's expectation that she would replace Erbakan as PM, President Demirel, the military left the choice to him, selected Mesut Yilmaz, whose Anavatan party had won the second largest number of seats in the parliament. Demirel and Çiller were not friends, and he may well have been paying off some political scores by passing over her and commissioning Yilmaz. Demirel's decision effectively ended her career. Another point worth making is that the character and attitude of the military leadership had changed. Previously, say at the time of the 1980 coup, the senior military appeared much more reticent about dealing with foreigners and very hesitant about assuming a political role and taking control of the government, even though there was at that time a popular hope and expectation that they would do so. There's a story, which I believe to be true, that a lieutenant came into the office of a senior general, whom I happen to know, and asked for permission to kill himself, given the situation of the country in 1980. The general reportedly threatened to shoot the young man himself if he did not immediately leave the office, adding that the lieutenant had no concept of the responsibilities of the senior military leadership and the enormous risks and damage to the country that would result from yet another military takeover. Conversely, by the time of the 1997 coup, senior Turkish commanders were a much more self-confident, outgoing, and aggressive lot, both certain of their military and political skills. I'm not sure I'm characterizing it adequately, but there was a noticeable difference that was remarked upon at the time. Quite possibly, this overconfidence played the military false in dealing with Recep Erdogan, who, if nothing else, is a very gifted and tough-minded politician. Since the ouster of Erbakan, and before the recent coup attempt, the military made several attempts to reassert its authority, which clearly had diminished. In 2007, the military threatened to intervene in a presidential election and warned the government to curb Islamic influences by preventing the election of Abdullah Gül, then Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, as Turkey's president. At that time, Turkish presidents were elected by the parliament. The military's warning was bolstered by secularist groups in parliament and by significant demonstrations out of doors. But Erdogan outmaneuvered them, and in the election, which was at that time mandated when there was parliamentary deadlock on choice of a president, he achieved a larger majority and was then, to the military's dismay, able to push through Gül's election. With that as background, we can take a look at the most recent coup attempt. As Turkey's political leadership engaged in unremitting, frequently vicious political infighting, a major game-changing political event was taking place almost off stage. If you will summon up a picture of the Anatolian Peninsula in your minds and divide it into quarters, what happened in the 1980s and 90s was a truly massive migration from the east, mostly the southeast, into the cities of Western European Anatolia. In 1980, the population of Istanbul was estimated at around 4.4 million. As a result of this migration, by 2000, Istanbul's population had more than doubled to 9.4 million, and by 2015 reached 12.5 million. Most of these new arrivals were slum dwellers, living in what the Turks called gecekondu's, meaning houses constructed overnight. I could see them in Ankara. Turkey's capital is in a sort of geologic bowl surrounded by hills, which helps to account for the heavy pollution that makes living there sometimes unpleasant or even dangerous. But you could see groups of these newly and quickly constructed houses ranging ever further and further up the hills surrounding Ankara. The southeast of Turkey is, of course, right next to Arabia. It is an area where the Ataturk reforms never really took root. The parties that helped with these new arrivals in the cities in western Turkey got their electricity connected, saw that their kids were enrolled in school, were the Islamist parties, often financially supported by Saudi Arabia, by the way. The mayor of Istanbul during this period was Recep Erdogan. This group and their children, now grown up, represent at least a significant part of the constituency for Erdogan's governing Justice and Development Party. This constituency is not really interested in diplomatic partnership in the West or membership in NATO, but is very supportive of Erdogan's efforts to reassert Turkey's Islamic heritage and leadership role. They are the groups that, when summoned by their hojas at the mosques, poured out into the streets of Istanbul and Ankara and other cities as well to thwart the most recent coup attempt and protect Erdogan and his government. There are a number of things that are still difficult to understand about the recent coup attempt. Among these, why didn't the plotters move to seize and arrest Erdogan first thing? Basic coup 101. According to the latest information, it seems he was alerted and left the place where he was vacationing in Marmaris, which is a truly lovely seaside resort, several hours before the group sent to arrest him arrived. The story that he had a hair's breadth escape appears to be mythology. Where he took shelter after his escape is not clear. The plotters appear not to have kept watch on him to ensure they knew exactly where he was. Why didn't they shut down the internet and other means of communication to disable government? It appears they tried, but were not totally successful. Erdogan was able to use one channel to communicate with supporters in Istanbul and to instruct via the Ministry of Religious Affairs that mosques throughout the country issue a call to bring them out into the streets. This was done by means of a salah prayer, which dates from the dates from the Ottoman era and had been used to announce difficult times during wars, though such prayers have seldom been heard since the establishment of the Turkish Republic. Now in Turkey, the imams at the mosque are government employees. There are 110,000 of them in 85,000 mosques. Many, not all, issued a call for people to come to the mosque, go out in the streets, and be courageous. This ultimately was how the coup was defeated. Also, the perhaps unexpected presence in the streets of such large groups, some of which reportedly had weapons of one kind or another, may help to explain the uncharacteristically bloody nature of the coup. I've also heard that some of those taken to the streets were refugees from Syria. The coup plotters had access to F-16s and helicopters. Why wasn't Erdogan's plane, which was an executive jet, shot down somewhere in its 290-mile flight between Marmaris and Istanbul? It seems that two F-16s actually locked onto the aircraft, which was being protected by two other F-16s. The attacking aircraft never opened fire, and the reason for this has not yet been explained. If the news report here is accurate, there was a split in the Air Force, some elements of which were heavily involved in the coup, while others remained loyal. Ironically, the apparent willingness of senior officers in the Air Force and other services to support the coup may have saved Erdogan's life and his government. What precipitated the coup? Hard to say. There was going to be a meeting in a few days of the military council to weed out Gulenist elements, more later on that, among the senior officer corps. This may have been the key instigator, though obviously the attempted takeover had been planned to some extent before that. Also, there may have been rising contempt within the military due to the renewed fighting against Kurdish groups, particularly among the Jandarma, the National Guard, which has done much of the fighting in the southeast. Also, government actions permitting ISIS to build a base of operations from Turkish soil, thereby increasing the threat of internal terrorism, which has a long history in Turkey, may have fueled opposition to Erdogan among the military. So what happens now? Certainly an enormous purge, trials, jail possible, though not certain, revival of the death penalty, and reprisals against political opponents. The scale will, I'm sure, ultimately rival or even exceed the crackdown following the 1980 coup. It extends already well into the military, judiciary, police, diplomatic corps, educators, businessmen, and soccer referees and players, among other groups. It has also reached overseas as Erdogan government lobbies other governments to close down schools associated with his opponents, and who may be involved in the coup attempt. Cautions from EU states or from Washington to exercise restraint against those suspected of involvement will be ignored or denounced. This is a fight for survival, and Erdogan, despite surviving this coup attempt, remains demonstrably a very worried man. The primary reason for this worry is that, despite some 14 years in power to weed out opposition within the military, as the event demonstrated, significant opposition remains and is capable of nearly bringing down his government. Also, the nature and character of the opposition has changed. In the past, the opposition was secular and Kemalist, but sadly, perhaps Kemalism appears all but defunct in Turkey. And with its secular democratic government, though democratic forms will continue to be employed. Erdogan, after all, is reported to have said that democracy is like a bus, which you ride until you get off. He has long since exited the bus. What we have now in Turkey is a power struggle between two Sufi orders. The press has reported it largely as a contest for power between Fethullah Gulen and Recep Erdogan, but it is more pernicious and perhaps more long-lasting. It needs to be understood as a power struggle between the Naqshbandi and Nurju Sufi sects. Of the two, the Naqshbandi sect is by far the older and larger, and is more mystical and orthodox in its theology, as I understand it, and religious sects and groupings within Islam are nothing if not complicated. The Nurju sect is an offshoot of the Naqshbandis, but is more worldly, Western-oriented, and in addition to education in Islam, also emphasizes education in sciences, Western logic, and other such topics. A bit more history here. In order to get Anatolian peasant support for the War of Independence, Ataturk had to cut deals with local religious leaders of Dervish or Naqshbandi sects, promising them continued influence. But Ataturk ultimately welched on the deal when he abolished the caliphate and then outlawed the Dervish sects, foremost among them the Naqshbandis, after a Naqshbandi warlord led a major revolt against his newly established secular government. Supposedly, all the sects were then driven underground, but in fact they remained very active. Since the founding of the Turkish Republic, in generation after generation, there have been efforts at expanded religious expression constrained by the military. As Turkey in the late 1940s and early 1950s turned toward an attempt to representative government, these sects became very much a political force. One reason Menderes and his Democratic Party were overthrown was because he was considered to be cutting too many details with the Sufi sects, particularly the Nurjus, in order to achieve his own form of strongman presidency, not unlike what Erdogan has become now. With only a couple of exceptions, every prime minister and one president in modern times has been a Naqshbandi. Erbakan, Turgut Özal, Abdullah Gül, Erdogan, Davutoglu, and now Ben Ali. Fethullah Gülen, meanwhile, is the leader of the Naqshbandis' current main rival order, the Nurju Sufis, who over decades had managed to penetrate into various parts of the Turkish civil service, the military, judiciary, and numerous other areas. They were successful, at least in part, because they had a Western education. And as technocrats, their careers prospered in Turkey's government. This veneer of Western orientation they had been enjoined to keep their religious views hidden until very late in the day also made them attractive to the secularist military. When the Justice and Development Party came to power in 2002-2003, the Naqshbandi and Nurju sects essentially teamed up to cut the military down to size, thereby reducing also the influence of secularists in governing Turkey. The Sledgehammer and Ergenekon trials, which authorities now agree were based on trumped-up evidence, indicted numerous senior military officers, both serving and retired. Those who had led previous coups, including former President Evren ailing and in his late 80s, were also made to stand trial. But after reducing successfully the power of the military, from about 2010 onward, the Nurjus and Naqshbandis turned on each other in what seems to have been nothing more than a struggle for bureaucratic and political power. In 2013, the Gulanists, the Nurjus, used the police and judiciary in an effort to bring down Erdogan and a number of his ministers on amply justified corruption charges. Erdogan, by the way, is the richest prime minister in Turkish history. The allegation and arrests were partly based on wiretaps of conversations of accused ministers, some involving Erdogan himself. He retaliated immediately by claiming the taps were fabricated and, instead of resigning, ordered dismissal or reassignment of the prosecutors and police involved, rightly counting on the support of his AKP, his political party's base. He shut down Gulen-affiliated banks, businesses, and media outlets, including Zaman, which was the country's largest newspaper, and has continued to expand this witch hunt. Another 2,500 or so police investigators, public prosecutors, and judges were about to be dismissed, along with members of the military when the coup intervened. The massive purge now underway is Erdogan's attempt to deal once and for all with the threat to him and his government posed by his former allies. It is unclear if he will succeed. He will get anything he wants from the parliament where his party has a significant majority. Given the extent of the purge and retaliation that will take place, opposition in the already cowed press or among Turks overseas with families back home will be muted. That said, the extent of infiltration into the security and military forces by the Nurcu opposition cannot be adequately gauged. So Turkey's alternatives are stark: an increasingly authoritarian rule by Erdogan, or episodic and popularly violent efforts to unseat him by the rival Sufi organization, which could ultimately deteriorate into civil war. Now, very briefly, I promise, let's turn to Turkey's foreign policy. Start with the fact that since the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, Turkey has been engaged in a prolonged identity crisis. Ataturk's solution, which was very generally accepted, was that Turkey should be both Western and ultimately democratic. This was not really as visionary as many have suggested. Generations of Ottoman sultans in Istanbul have dealt with the West and paved the way for Ataturk. The 1995 agreement for a customs union with the EU was hailed in Turkey with headlines such as, "We are Europeans now," demonstrating at least the fulfillment of at least a portion of Ataturk's vision. Of course, the main ornament in Turkey's Western orientation was its membership in NATO, to which Turks pointed with pride as signifying its membership as part of the Western Club due to its vital role as anchor of the alliance's southeastern flank. This view was always something of a distortion. The U.S. government had to do significant arm twisting among European NATO allies to secure Turkey's admission. And since that time, Ankara's membership in the alliance has been almost exclusively a U.S.-Turkish affair, with minimal participation by other NATO states. But over the past roughly 30 years, Turkey has moved away from its never quite completed Western moorings. This did not happen all at once and can be tracked in a number of milestones during this period. The first and foremost of these turning points was, of course, the collapse of the Soviet Union. The end of the Soviet Empire and breakup of the Warsaw Pact diminished the pride and importance Turkey attached to NATO membership, as well as U.S. and European assessments of Turkey's strategic value. Some in the State Department at that time privately characterized policy toward Turkey as managing a relationship in decline. In reaction, and in search of a new role, Ankara initially tried to position itself as the leader of the Turkic states that used to form part of the USSR. This effort generally fizzled due to determined opposition from Iran and Russia, who saw Turkey as a stalking horse for Washington, as well as to the arrogance and clumsiness with which Ankara put forward its claim. Just as critical in Turkey's evolution away from the West was the development in the country's social history mentioned earlier. Discussing the outlook of the vast numbers migrating from eastern to western Turkey, a very prescient public affairs officer at Embassy Ankara pointed out to me 20 years ago, even before the advent of the Erdogan government, that Turks were no longer interested in what had formerly been their long-standing desire for acceptance in the West and membership in the EU and NATO. The sentiments and critical electoral weight of this group have played a significant role in moving Turkey's leadership out of the Western orbit. complicated legacy of Desert Storm. Prior to that operation, Turkey had almost exclusively restricted U.S. operation from its soil to those under the NATO rubric. The decision to permit strike missions from Turkey was a major and controversial step away from what had been a very strictly enforced policy. Then Prime Minister Özal's decision, which incidentally triggered the resignation of a very well thought of chief of the Turkish General Staff, Necip Torrentay, rested in part on the calculation that Turkey would benefit not only economically and militarily, but also by securing once and for all recognition of its place as a Western society and value as an ally. But results did not meet these expectations. Turks have long felt that Desert Storm left them less, not more, secure. A primary reason was establishment of a semi-autonomous, economically viable Kurdish enclave directly on the Turkish border, which was an unintended consequence of the operation, and which created an enduring security headache concerning the future of Turkey's resource-rich, heavily Kurdish-populated southeast. The region includes headwaters of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers that are important not only economically, with development planned to supply some 20% of Turkey's hydroelectric power, but also politically, giving Ankara significant leverage over Syria and Iraq, whose main water supply it can reduce at need. Ankara has constantly worried that the restive southeast region might seek to join the newly created autonomous Turkish enclave just across the border to become a separate state, dismembering Turkey and depriving it of these important natural resources and strategic advantages. Yet another legacy of Turkey's decision to permit combat operations for Desert Storm was Washington's overly confident anticipation that Ankara would be similarly compliant in permitting transit by the 4th Mechanized Division to invade northern Iraq. The Erdogan government, still in its infancy, negotiated a lucrative deal to permit this and urged ratification by the Turkish parliament. The measure was approved narrowly but failed because numbers in favor were less than one-half parliament's total membership. Despite U.S. urging, the Erdogan government declined to reintroduce the measure, which it proved extremely unpopular both among members of the governing party and out of doors. The result jarred Washington and left a permanent scar on the relationship, despite Turkey's permission, which I think is ongoing, to use Incirlik as a resupply center for operations in Iraq. As far as Turkey is concerned, a major result of our two military involvements in Iraq has been to diminish Ankara's confidence in close military ties with Washington and to push it toward more cooperative relationship with longtime adversaries Syria and Iran, countries who also have troubles with their own Kurdish populations. Furthering this remarkable transformation were the difficulties the U.S. and its allies have faced in subduing Iraq and Afghanistan. The duration of these still unresolved conflicts, the massive resources expended by Washington, and diminished American popular support for military involvement have induced officials in Ankara and elsewhere to estimate that U.S. influence and capabilities may have been permanently weakened. Further, in the GOT's view, current results of these wars have compromised the stature of traditional U.S. allies such as Saudi Arabia and Egypt, possibly opening the way for Ankara to assert a leading or even preeminent role in that region. There continued to be signposts of the way things were going. In the 2008 global financial crisis, Erdogan did not seek help from the IMF, as had been done in earlier financial meltdowns. Instead, the AKP government and many Turkish businessmen increased trade and investment in Russia and Middle Eastern countries as part of a proactive approach to countering the crisis. Erdogan's response to the GFC demonstrated his confidence in the then growing strength of the Turkish economy, and most interestingly, willingness to go it alone without having recourse to Western financial institutions, which themselves have been compromised by the crisis. The still unsuccessful effort to find a new focus for Turkey's foreign policy by exploiting ethnic and linguistic ties to the Caucasus and Central Asia was followed by the reassertion of its role as a leading Islamic state. Hopes of elbowing aside Saudi Arabia and Egypt as the leader of Muslim states in and around the Arabian Peninsula, and to emerge as a champion of the Palestinians, energized this approach. Such a gambit has not, and ultimately, I think, will not succeed, as Arab states have few fond memories of being under the sway of the Sublime Porte. Also, Arabs and Turks traditionally and heartily disesteem each other. One can go on and on. Erdogan's dramatic cooling of what was once a strategic relationship with Israel, a partnership that was useful to Washington and very important to Tel Aviv, was acclaimed in the region, but now has been partially reversed. Despite modest recent improvements, no one really expects the relationship to regain its former vitality. The Erdogan government seems to have abandoned its initiative, which had gone nowhere, seeking improved relations with Armenia. Its loudly proclaimed effort to develop close relations with Egypt came to nothing once former President Morsi was deposed. Assiduous courting of Iraq's Kurdish regional government, following by assurances to Baghdad that Turkey did not desire the breakup of Iraq, followed by renewed war against the Kurds, including sorties into KRG territory, have clouded relations with Iraq and with its Kurdish population. Meanwhile, partnership with Assad, followed by efforts to drive him from power that have included assistance both to al-Nusra and ISIS, recent hints of a desire for rapprochement with Assad's government, followed by a military incursion of uncertain length into Syria that has elicited cries of dismay from Damascus and expressions of strong concern in Moscow, all demonstrate a foreign policy that is both excessively opportunistic and strategically adrift. Does all of this foreshadow Turkey's severing ties with NATO in favor of partnership with Russia? Weighing matters as best I can, I don't think so. Though there have been earlier periods of cordiality, Turkey and Russia have most often been at daggers drawn since the time of Catherine the Great, a tradition that puts a lot of historical momentum behind their lingering distrust and dislike. Unambiguous partnership at Russia at this time would, first of all, require complete reversal of Erdogan's efforts to dislodge Assad. He may now be leaning in that direction, at least for the next 5 minutes or so. Perhaps he has concluded that groups seeking Assad's ouster ultimately will not succeed, and that Turkey's interests are for the most part better served by some vague courtship of the winning side, while he pursues efforts to reverse expansion of Kurdish-controlled areas next to Turkey's border. Nevertheless, a clear shift in Assad's and Russia's direction would complicate already deteriorated relations with Washington and much of Europe. They would also raise immediately and perhaps unresolvable issues with regard to U.S. strike missions from Incirlik Air Base. Perhaps even worse from Erdogan's standpoint, it would also irretrievably damage his aspirations to emerge as the leader of regional Muslim states, which have bankrolled Turkey's assistance to anti-Assad groups, including al-Nusra and ISIS. The Eurasian, largely Turkic states would still be unenthusiastic about enhanced Turkish influence in that region, even or perhaps because it had Russian support. In consequence, the recent eyelash fluttering between Presidents Putin and Erdogan likely presage only a limited and temporary warming of relations. The point is that Turkey's connections with the West and to NATO have, over time, significantly attenuated. Even Turkey's assistance to the USG and to NATO in Syria upon examination may be less critical than press items and op-ed pieces routinely assert. Military authorities I have consulted advise that, at least with regard to the war in Syria, there is nothing that takes place at Incirlik Air Base that could not be accomplished from aircraft carriers or other bases in the region, albeit with greater inconvenience. Also, Turkey's assistance in terms of movement of weapons, supplies, and personnel to al-Nusra and ISIS further undercuts the value of its provision of access to Incirlik. I know there were some in the Pentagon who quietly hoped for success of the recent coup out of anger at the support Turkey has provided groups the U.S. is fighting in Syria. Perhaps the best way to end this presentation would be to quote an email from a close friend who grew up in Turkey and knows the country far better than I. She tends to be quite blunt in expressing her views, but also has an irritating tendency to be right almost all the time. Turkey has left the building. The government has gutted its military, which is no longer of use to NATO. As for Incirlik operations, I have it on good authority that nothing momentous is happening at the air base, and there is a real desire by many to stop pretending that Incirlik under Erdogan is an asset. The Turkish military was important to NATO because of its location, capabilities, and loyalty to Western ideals. No matter how you look at it, the Turkish military of NATO days is completely gone. The only reason Turkey is still in NATO is that no one wants to deal publicly and immediately with the fact that the world has changed dramatically. I responded that despite Turkey's diminished role, I saw no reason to take any action that would terminate the country's NATO membership, and to let Erdogan do it if it is going to happen. Nevertheless, it cannot be denied that Turkey has become a loose cannon, that its value as an ally has considerably diminished, and that as it becomes increasingly unpredictable in its foreign policy and preoccupied with domestic concerns, that value will decrease further. Thank you.
Marty, thank you very much. That was about as information-packed a presentation as I could imagine. We'll all be tested on this down the line, and the test papers will come out. I think we do have some time for questions, and so I'll just let you field them as you wish.
In your opinion, do you believe the guy in Pennsylvania was behind the coup?
There's no way of telling, and I'm quite happy to leave that to the American legal process in this regard. But what we have is impatience and even genuine anger. There is a tendency, and I've seen it myself in Turkey, to suspect an American hand in everything. But ultimately, we'll just have to wait and see. In my opinion, it's possible, but I have no way of knowing.
There is a parallel universe. Government, as he said, as Erdogan said.
Well, I think that there is, what did he say, a state within a state as a result of those who are Gurju members who ultimately got to a point where they were very important in the various offices or bureaus or government departments, including the security and military. And Erdogan is, in his own unique way, also responsible for this. And what we see now is an effort of him to, having realized his mistake, to drive these people out, throw them in jail, get them out of the country, find the hell out of any newspapers so that they are afraid to print anything critical of the government and deal in that fashion. But the fact that there was a state within a state or an alternative state to his, these groups were struggling for power, have been struggling for power for the last half a decade or so.
Will the U.S. give them up? Don't know.
There's no way of telling. I'm not a lawyer and I'm not involved in that, thank God.
I had a comment, please.
Sure.
Well, I believe, yes, he is behind it, because Gülen movement has been. I was taking notes about it.
Oh dear.
Yeah. They've been doing some kind of works related with Turkey and other countries, Turkic countries like Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, and other countries. And also they were building schools. They were building institutions. Recently, Russia closed some of the schools because they said that these schools doesn't serve any kind of religion, any kind of other social organization. They are serving some ideology. That's why they shut down. And it is known in Turkey especially, those schools were stolen some questions. Of course, they were working with the government, Erdogan's government. Right now, they're enemies, and then those all pops up. And they were stolen some questions, especially for military schools. And they were doing unjust hiring, promotions in schools, and also the institutions in the government, and especially in like high level of governments where like lawyers, militaries, and other like schools. And also, you're welcome to go online on YouTube, find Gülen's speech on how to leak into a government. So, and this is from like 20 years ago. And they've been here. I know some of the guys. They're the majority of them in Houston right now, and they're somehow are given green cards. Somehow given investor visas. They have their own business here. And the thing is, what I believe, I worked for them for 1 year. I wasn't a supporter. I'm not even a supporter of Erdogan, but I did my internship with them. And the Islamic cult, I don't know why they're in a Christian country anyways, and have 3 levels. One level is believers. They believe and they think that they're doing something related with religion. The second level is higher than them, and they are the bank for the movement, bank for the organization, which means they have the investor visas, they are doing their own business in here, and then when some of the people from the movement, let's say, is having a bad business situation, and then all of a sudden they start to help him it's just like a cult, to help him go better. And then the upper level, which I believe is, and also the evidence shows that, has one rule, which is converting Turkey in an Islamic state, Islamic country. And with the last coup, it was an attempt, and I believe it was one part of the military, and the other people in the military, they were like, okay, we're gonna support you, and then we're gonna do this with you. And I think they were either secular or the Erdogan's supporters. And then that's how they fooled them, and then they started to do the coup, and then all of a sudden, with of course the people went on the street and tried to stop it, and then that's how they failed it. So I believe, yes, Gülen movement or Gülen terrorist organization or Gülen organization is behind this last coup. They have been working to take over the country for so long. I know many friends who got bad stories in military, in schools, just because they were not from a Gülen movement, and like let's say you're not a supporter, you don't go to Gülen's school, you don't know Gülen's school that make you study to the exam for your university, so you can't be a part of that institution. You're not able to work there, or you're not able to study there anymore. So yes, I believe they are behind it.
Well, I'm confident that the Gülen organization was behind it, but that's not quite the same thing as Gülen himself.
Oh yeah.
Well, was behind it, or even if he was, proving it in a court of law is another issue. Also, there is a legitimate issue even were he convicted. Should he be sent back given the human rights concerns, because he would be thrown in jail for the next 250 years, if not hanged or whatever at that point. And so there are a number of questions that I think need to be addressed there.
Gülen says himself, those guys who tried to do the coup may know me, but I don't know them.
Okay,
So.
well. So, what you say, I grant, is true, but as may have emerged from what I was saying, I hold no brief for Erdogan either. And he himself, and he apologized for this, as I'm sure you know, for not gauging the potential danger there sufficiently early. And it was a considerable misjudgment on his part. Yes, ma'am.
I wanted to, shifting gears just a little bit, ask you, since you've advised so many policymakers in the United States,
Oh, would that were true.
if you could share with us what you would say to the next president coming in terms of how to deal with Turkey and what kind of a priority to make of the relationship with Turkey, whether through NATO or just bilaterally.
Is that all you want to know? My initial reaction, and it's only an initial one because the question is very good, is wait and see. A new president always has a learning curve, and perhaps for one of the individuals now campaigning for the office, the learning curve itself might be excruciating. I won't say whom I'm referring to. But there is no immediate rush to do much of anything with regard to Turkey. Moreover, you have to think of Turkey in the larger regional conflict. Turkey used to be considered part, the State Department is divided into bureaus, and at one time Turkey was part of the Middle Eastern Bureau. But it was traded to the European Bureau, I suppose, for 2 draft choices and future considerations. But what happens in Turkey affects relations with Russia, the situation in Iraq, the situation in Syria, what happens in Greece, what happens with NATO, and all of that has to be brought into some consideration. So if asked, and I somehow have a feeling I won't be, I would tell the president, do not flirt with Erdogan, do not keep undue distance from him, and just wait and see what happens in the interim. In the meantime, take advantage of what you can from Turkey's involvement in the region without drawing too close to him. That would be purely off the top of my head.
Could you draw a parallel between the coups and everything and Erdogan coming into power, but the economy tracked so brilliantly with his leadership? The cranes, the building, the development, the quest to get the Olympics. But now there's no tourists. Business is horrible, and Turks usually vote their pocketbooks. How do you see that affecting?
Well, I'm not... a couple of questions. First of all, I'm not an economist, as people will tell you, but the economic success of the early Erdogan era, a lot of people were looking at it at that time and saying, this is a bubble. It will not last. Well, it was sustained over time. At the same time, Erdogan has started to dictate economic policy in a way that has very little to do with the market, but has a lot to do with his own preferences. And that is not helpful. Also, there's now established terrorism, and likely to be more in Turkey. Also, his country is involved in a couple of wars, one in the southeast, one in Syria. And the deepening repression that is going on is also an inhibitor to economic activity. So what he is doing ultimately will lead to worse economic times. At the same time, people sometimes don't vote their pocketbooks. He does have, as we've seen in the past events, a very committed group of supporters, which is quite large and quite willing literally to take into the streets on his behalf. I think you're going to see Erdogan for another 10 years at least. And I'm just as unhappy as you are about it. Yes, ma'am.
Is he mentally ill? I know that's a strange question, but my friends and I are always discussing, is he crazy?
All power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely.
That's a safe thing to say.
And No, he's not crazy. He's a very gifted politician. He's a very tough guy. And the Turks themselves understand and value that. And he has succeeded, if you want to call it that, in remaking Turkish government in his own image and in introducing servility in the press, now in the bureaucracy, once the Gulanis are expelled, now in the military, and that's largely happened, so it seems, although you never know, because the Gulanis, as you pointed out, sir, are have infiltrated so successfully, and moreover, they are counseled to keep their views to themselves for religious and other reasons. So, but now Erdogan is, I wouldn't say he's ill, I would think he's very clever and perhaps has a tendency toward megalomania. But I am not a psychologist, and I would not want to hang myself on in terms of that. Yes?
So it's clear from what you've said that the semblance of democracy in Turkey is no longer there. It's apparent that it's not a democratic country, and Erdogan obviously is becoming more and more authoritarian. What concerned me more than that is the underlying comment that you had that there are no more secularists left in Turkey, which under the Kemalist regimes was really the guiding principle for keeping Turkey close to NATO and to the Europeans. After Erdogan is gone, have we still lost Turkey, the nation? Are they no longer going to be part of the West in their viewpoint? Are the people who are left there being educated in a way that Turkey is now gone from the Western Hemisphere, and we should kind of consider it, our strategy in the future should be, it's no longer with us?
Wow. Turkey has tried to become a democratic country, let's say for sake of generalization, for the past 60 years. It never has gotten it right yet. Now the Turks are the most Western-oriented and most successful in many ways of the Islamic peoples. And I am no supporter of Donald Trump, but I wonder about the suitability of democracy and how compatible it is with Islam, at least in where Islam is commonly practiced. When an individual comes here and takes an oath to the United States Constitution and becomes a citizen, that's a different matter altogether. I don't recall saying that there were no secularists left in Turkey. What I was trying to say is that the influence of secularism is very, very much diminished. And whether it will make a comeback, as all things can, I don't know. I don't think so. I think you could make a case, and I was mentally toying with this, that secularism as imposed by the military and by Ataturk had adherents, but the adherence was may have been nowhere near as generalized or accepted, at least in the vast of the numbers of the population who are much more religiously oriented, and that we have mistakenly regarded Turkey as a secular state. And it has struggled to release itself from those boundaries over time. Whether we should consider Turkey as lost, we have plenty of allies who are Islamic, but in terms of the mercurial nature of this particular government and this particular individual, I would say Turkey is no longer a trustworthy ally, which is a different sort of a thing. Best answer I can give you. Yes?
Could you comment on the deal that Turkey and Erdogan struck with the European Union on the refugee situation? Why did they, I know they got a lot of money for it, but why did they do it? And what do you think the long-term impact of that's going to be?
Remember I said something about Turks and Arabs not getting along that well. If you call a Turk an Arab, you're likely to get a knuckle sandwich.
That's true.
And there are various sayings in Turkish. The Turkish term for a real mess is Arap saçları, Arab hair. And one of my favorite is Araç tatadan paşa Araptan olmaz. You can't make a brazier out of wood, and you can't make a general out of an Arab. And I'm sure there are other sayings on the other side as well. I just don't know the language, or don't have the skill to show it off. The massive, I keep saying massive, the very large migration to the West through Turkey was never welcomed politically, and Erdogan got himself in some political trouble by opening the doors of Turkey as much as he did for this influx. And he's, I'm sure, glad to be rid of them and to get some benefit, although some is being withheld from Europe. The problem that we have now, I think, is just how massive this might become. Egypt is in for increasing economic trouble at this point. And if the war were to generalize further, you could see a truly astounding number of migrants trying to reach Western Europe and relative safety there. And it already seems in some cases it could be destabilizing, at least potentially, to European states. I do not know how this problem is going to be solved. And I think the major gateway is Turkey. And I think this is promoting on both sides that the Turks don't want these guys even more, these migrants, and still less do the Europeans want them. And the only way to resolve the crisis there is directly in Syria and across the Mediterranean in Libya, oh, by the way, and which requires, I think, some revival and imposition of a military solution in both cases. I don't think it's going to happen easily. I would suggest that cooperation between the United States and Russia, which there have been efforts at, would be a major step in that direction to impose a solution and give these people a chance to come back to their homes and rebuild their shattered lives. I also think that as reprehensible as Assad's government is, even the recreation of the police state that was and is his government might be acceptable now to people who have experienced more than 5 years of civil war with all the attendant miseries. Yes?
There are millions of Turks and Turkish Germans in Germany, and I wondered, you said that Turkey has become a loose cannon if the immigrants and citizens of that country can help in making Turkey less loose, or, what do you think?
Well, if I recall, recently there was efforts at a pro-Erdogan major demonstration in Germany itself. And I think those Turks in Turkey, and that's been a problem for I won't say a problem, but an issue, shall we say, for decades in Germany, are there to stay. They left Turkey for a reason. They probably don't want to go back, but they may have strong feelings about Turkey still. And the answer briefly to your question would be no. I don't think they're going to have any real role in stabilizing or making the loose Turkish cannon less loose. But although they do vote in Turkish elections, if I remember correctly. So we'd have to see, but by and large, I think the answer is no. Yes, sir.
So you talked about the migration of people into the West, and my recollection is that started a number of years ago, and so but now there's a fairly substantial young, almost millennial population of fairly well-educated young people throughout Turkey that are coming through the university systems and are young people. What's your take on the kind of impact that these young people getting into positions where they are playing games of politics and business and whatnot might have on the future of Turkey, not necessarily the Erdogan government, but looking at the long term as somebody started the conversation towards for, in the downstream in the future?
Sir, I really don't know. First of all, I haven't lived in Turkey for a very long time to get a feeling for this. And the military, the universities in Turkey have been areas that have been venues for political demonstrations and even violent political demonstrations in the past. But what they will be like in the future, or what influence they may have as the Turkish economy shifts and as the Erdogan government reaches and goes beyond its maturity, I don't know. Don't think that can be predicted yet.
Thank you.
Sir.
Could we go back to the spring of 2003 that you addressed earlier, and the effort in connection with the invasion of Iraq to bring the 4th Mechanized Unit from southern Turkey into northern Iraq as part of the American invasion,
Yes.
and the Turkish parliament turning that down? As you recall, when that happened, you and I had to go, along with an American general, to the Minister of Defense in Saudi Arabia and ask them if it was okay for us to bring a couple of submarines into the Red Sea and then shoot cruise missiles over Saudi Arabia into Iraq to achieve the same ends, which permission was given.
Yes.
But how could it be that we would have missed the consequence of that vote in the Turkish parliament so badly? Was it a failure of intelligence? Was it a head fake? Was it the belief that bribery of the government was going to be sufficient? How did we miss that?
Well, sir, Ambassador, first of all, I know because of the expectations at that time, they felt the Turks would play along and get this to happen. And as you know very well, what happened is the 4th Infantry Division went the other way and went through the Suez Canal and became involved in fighting in that direction. And Donald Rumsfeld, I believe to this day, blames the failure to bring the 4th Infantry Division down through Turkey into Iraq for what has happened in Iraq since that time. Personally, I think this is nonsense. But that is what he believes. And what happened in Turkey what happened in northern Iraq was that U.S. airborne troops were landed there, and the Kurds gave permission for this. It was missed? It was still a very young Bush government. It was still an even younger Erdogan government, and it was a very lucrative deal that was, in terms of vast amounts of money and very considerable trade concessions and other things. The Erdogan government drove a very hard bargain, and I hypothesize that they too felt it would pass and were taken aback by the opposition they faced. But ultimately they decided it was better not to do this and take the heat from the United States than to face the heat from their own countrymen.
Thank you very much. This has been a fantastic presentation. We really appreciate it.
It's been my pleasure.